Gnostics of Education by Richard M. Weaver. More than any other nation, the United States has chosen to look upon its schools at all levels as means of education rather than mere instruction. Footnote. The theme of this chapter was suggested by Eric Voegelin's The New Science of Politics, 1952. End of footnote. The difference is an important one, since education means not merely the imparting of information to the mind, but the shaping of the mind and of the personality. Instruction may be limited to the transmission of facts and principles it is desirable to know as a body of knowledge, but education is unavoidably a training for a way of life. Education comprises instruction, of course, but it goes beyond instruction to a point that makes it intimately related to the preservation of a culture. Under normal conditions, the points of view that an educator instills are the points of view of the culture, and actually nothing else is possible as a settled thing, because an education and a culture working at cross purposes can only produce a conflict which has to be resolved. A conflict of this kind of serious proportions has developed in our country with the ascension to influence of the progressive theory of education. There are by now many hopeful signs that the battle has been essentially decided, and that the danger carried by progressivism is drawing to an end. The threat of Russian technological rivalry, symbolized especially by the Sputniks and other more healthful pressures, may before long produce far-reaching changes in the dominant American educational philosophy. What I propose to discuss in this chapter may therefore before long be history, but since it is the kind of history from which one may learn a great deal about philosophical dead ends and educational follies, the story needs telling in perspective, and the moral needs to be drawn. It is not too much to say that in the past 50 years, public education in the United States has been in the hands of revolutionaries. To grasp the nature of their attempted revolution, we need only realize that in the past, every educational system has reflected to a great extent the social and political constitution of the society which supported it. This was assumed to be a natural and proper thing, since the young were to be trained to take places in the world that existed around them. They were indoctrinated with this world because its laws and relations were those by which they were expected to order their lives. In the period just mentioned, however, we have witnessed something never before seen in the form of a systematic attempt to undermine a society's traditions and beliefs through the educational establishment, which is usually employed to maintain them. There has been an extraordinary occurrence, a virtual educational coup d'etat carried out by a specially inclined minority. This minority has been, in essence, a cabal, with objectives radically different from those of the state which employed them. An amazing feature of the situation has been how little they have cared to conceal these objectives. On more than one occasion, they have issued a virtual call to arms to use publicly created facilities for the purpose of actualizing a concept of society not espoused by the people. The result has been an educational system not only intrinsically bad, but increasingly at war with the aims of the community which authorizes it, as we are now forced to recognize. Although the history of how the situation came about is not the principal inquiry here, a little background may make the facts seem less incredible. Public education was an outgrowth of the reasonable idea that a people cannot remain self-governing and free if they are untaught. It grew slowly during the 19th century until the coming of industrialism created demands for certain practical branches of it. In this growth, few saw anything alarming, except perhaps a tendency to look upon universal literacy as a panacea. At one point in the development, however, there occurred a sinister change. This came about when state bureaucracies were created to set the terms and supervise the working of the expanding public school system. State legislators felt that they had to turn the actual administration of affairs over to a body of experts. In course of time, these state departments of education became virtually autonomous in their power to define the goals, methods, and materials of public instruction. The final step came when they were able to require all prospective public school teachers through the high school level to take a set number of courses in a subject called education, wherein the philosophical premises and aims of the new educators were taught. This is where the doctrinal revolution referred to above really took place. Here was an educational system within the educational system, committed to a body of methodology whose goals were defined by a philosophical sect. I have said that the new education, for which the name progressive has been preempted by its advocates, is in marked conflict with our basic traditions and culture. It is not something based upon American experience or European experience or any perceptive view of the history of man. It is rather something dreamed up by romantic enthusiasts, political fanatics, and unreflective acolytes of positive science. These are all people looking to the future, and the future, as with all who try to protect themselves with this phrase, is their subjective feeling about the way things ought to go. We are told by them that we are living in a world of change, but the catch is that they are in charge of the change. They are the prophets of the new future, which is going to look very unlike the past. There is no difficulty at all in specifying reasons for the above change. I list below some of the chief assumptions and tenets of progressive education. The conflict between them and the principal teachings of the Judeo-Christian classical heritage of the West will be immediately apparent. 1. There is no such thing as a body of knowledge which reflects the structure of reality and which everyone therefore needs to learn. Knowledge is viewed as an instrumentality which is true or false according to the way it is applied to concrete situations or the way it serves the needs of the individual. Since these educators have embraced the notion that the essence of the world is change, there is no final knowledge about anything. The truths of yesterday are the falsehoods of today, and the truths of today will be the falsehoods of tomorrow. 2. This being so, the object of education is not to teach knowledge, but to teach students. As they translate this into practice, it means that everything should be adapted to the child as child, to the youth as youth, and to the particular group according to its limitations. There are no ideals or standards of performance by which these are bound to measure themselves by or to respect. 3. As a corollary of the above principle, the child should be encouraged to follow his own desires in deciding what he should study and what aspects of what subjects, and at what times. 4. The teacher must not think of himself as being in authority because authority is evil. The teacher is there as a leader, but the duty of the leader is only to synchronize and cooperate with the work of the group. 5. The student should never be made afraid of anything connected with the school. Marks and competitions are bad because they instill feelings of superiority and inferiority, which are undemocratic. 6. The mind is not to be exalted over the senses. Democracy requires that sensory and activist learning be valued on a par with intellectual learning. The mentally slow or retarded are not to be made to feel that they are lacking. It is better to impugn the whole tradition of intellectual education than to injure the feelings of the less bright and the lazy. 7. Consequently, there should be less education through symbols like language and figures, and more through using the hands on concrete objects. It is more important to make maps than to learn them, said John Dewey, the grand pundit of the revolutionary movement. 8. The general aim is to train the student so that he will adjust himself not simply to the existing society, as is sometimes inferred from their words, but to society conceived as social democracy. A few other propositions equally startling can be deduced from the writings of the new school of educationists, but these should be enough to indicate what a complete reversal the progressivist theory represents. However, Just in case the meaning of this is too revolutionary to reach the consciousness all at once, let me rephrase two or three of the central ideas. Knowledge, which has been the traditional reason for instituting schools, does not exist in any absolute or binding sense. The mind, which has always been regarded as the distinguishing possession of the human race, is now viewed as a tyrant which has been denying the rights of the body as a whole. It is to be democratized or reduced to an equality with the rest. Discipline, that great shaper of mind and body, is to be discarded because it carries elements of fear and compulsion. The student is to be prepared not to save his soul or to inherit the wisdom and usages of past civilizations, or even to get ahead in life, but to become a member of a utopia resting on a false view of both nature and man. This set of propositions practically inverts our traditional idea of education, which venerates mind, recognizes the moral and practical value of discipline, and regards competition as the indispensable spur to outstanding achievement. Yet these are the very propositions which have been systematically taught by educationists for about 50 years, and which have strongly affected education on all but the university levels, and even there in some areas. In fact, they have been more than taught, they have been enforced as dogmas in the schools and departments of education, and more than one prospective teacher has been advised that he must accept them or be rejected by the profession. Where should one look to find the real sources of so profound a revolt against the long accepted premises of education? Since we are dealing here with the change of great depth, it seems best not to spend time on intermediate causes, but to look for some major parallels in history and see whether this will not point to the ultimate cause. Progressive education is a wholesale apostasy involving abandonment of fundamental and long held beliefs about man and the world. If we are to account for it, we shall have to seek further than the pressures of industrialism and other modern day phenomena. The analysis will concern basic attitudes toward existence, so that if we search for the root of the progressivist outlook, we shall perforce be dealing with questions of faith and of interpretation of historical experience. There is one apostasy of a nature and a magnitude to warrant comparison with this one, and it affords a great deal of illumination, even though it happened at a remote time, and even though its content cannot be precisely delineated. It was a subversive force in much the same way as our progressivism in education, and although it was finally put down, it lasted long enough to produce a large amount of confusion and to cause the thoughtful to search out its fundamental errors. This was the Gnosticism of the 1st and 2nd centuries AD. Gnosticism may be described as an attempt to reinterpret analytic Christianity in terms suited to the Enlightenment of the contemporary era. It was a highly speculative system which differed from what has become canonical Christianity in two important features: its attitude toward creation and its doctrine of the nature of man. According to the Gnostics, creation was not the work of an omnipotent and benevolent creator, but rather of a demiurge of limited power who necessarily left it finite and incomplete. Evil was therefore represented by them as congenital with creation. The important consequence of this doctrine was that it taught a dualism of good and evil, in which spirit, represented by man, was good, and in which the world, at least partly, represented evil. Man was therefore superior to the created universe, and although this cannot be set forth in very exact terms, was somehow charged with its improvement. The opponents of Gnosticism, both Christian and Neoplatonic, attacked the Gnostics for the presumptuousness of this attitude toward creation. For example, Tertullian, in his 5 books against Marcion, scored that famous Gnostic for his position on this matter. He wrote, "You, however, are a disciple above his master, and a servant above his Lord. You have a higher level of discernment than his. You destroy what he requires. You are an enemy to the sky, and yet you are glad to catch its freshness in your houses. You disparage the earth, although the elemental parent of your flesh, as if it were your undoubted enemy, and yet you abstract from it all its fatness for your food. In much the same vein, Plotinus, in his Aeneads, criticizes the human audacity of the Gnostics. Two people inhabit the one stately house. One of them declaims against its plan and against its architect, but none the less maintains his residence in it. The other makes no complaint, asserts the entire competence of the architect, and waits cheerfully for the day when he may leave it, having no further need of a house. Thus, the Gnostics were consistently seen as setting themselves above creation and holding that the material universe, for which they were not responsible, was the real source of evil. With regard to man himself, the Gnostics taught a doctrine of perfectionism. Man did not require salvation, for he was already in a state of messianic blessedness. Since he was in this state, it was not necessary for him to submit to external authority. Gnosticism therefore tended strongly towards antinomianism. This view of the natural blessedness of man, coupled with the feeling of his lack of responsibility for evil, made the Gnostics anti-authoritarian. When they were asked by the Christian fathers where they got their doctrines, they said that they had got them from themselves. As a matter of fact, they taught that every individual has a hidden deep from which there well up thoughts, notions, and impulses. A modern student of the Gnostic movement has noted that this resembles in a number of ways the subliminal self of modern psychology. We could go on to remark that all this has a parallel in the attempts of our progressive educationists to base everything upon psychology. The decision of the Fathers to reject Gnostic teachings was crucial for the future of Christianity, for the world of the Gnostics was a fanciful world, molded to the heart's desire, in which the religious imagination was not tied down to religious facts. Furthermore, such sociology and science as Gnosticism presumed to incorporate were not elements of strength. These consisted of the fashionable doctrines of the day and would have proved an increasing liability with the passage of time. The Fathers were not seduced by the modernism of their age. The decision which they made was not only wise for their time, but wise for any time in which this kind of choice has to be made. What they did was repudiate theorizing and adhere to analytic and historical religion. Thus, they retained on their side the powerful support of historicity with its facts and traditions. These were, of course, the fruit of experience, not of conjecture and speculation. The word of a prophet is a deed, it has been said, and they adhered to the word. Debate might range far, but there were always the records, the experiences, and the traditions to return to. Today we are in a strikingly comparable situation, as enthusiasts and fanciful thinkers call upon us to abandon what we know through the annals of our education and erect a brave new world out of sanguine speculation. Just as the very authority and power of Christianity depended upon rejecting these overtures, so the authority and viability of education today depend upon our rejecting the often plausible appeals of the progressives to give up what we know historically about man and commit ourselves to their utopia. In sum, it is the contention here that the progressive educationists of our time, while not Gnostics in the sense of historical descent, are Gnostics in their thinking. It is a further contention that their Gnosticism exhibits the same kind of delusion, fantasy, unreality, and unacceptable metaphysics which the Church Fathers, speaking out of tradition and true insight, challenged and put an end to. Finally, it is my own conviction that the doctrines of the new educationists are at least as menacing to the survival of our culture as were the Gnostic heresies of the 1st and 2nd centuries to the great religious and cultural tradition which has streamed down to our time. For the essence of Gnosticism is a kind of irresponsibility, an irresponsibility to the past and to the structure of reality in the present. Its teachings cannot serve as the foundation of a culture, because the fact that its advocates are out of line with what is inevitably reveals itself. Where they are allowed to provide foundations, they imperil the whole structure. The following are a number of specific ways in which our educationists of the New Order parallel the Gnostics of antiquity. Let us note before taking them up that education at any level will reflect the primary assumptions that we make about reality, and for this reason, no education is innocent of an attitude toward the existing world. In the way that it explains the interrelationships of phenomena and our relationships toward them, education will reveal beliefs about creation. Even if it denies that the world is something created by a creator, it thereby invokes a theory and prepares ground for an attitude. Of great significance here is the Gnostic account of creation. For the Gnostics, let us remember, creation was the work of a demiurge, who, for lack of omnipotence, had to leave his production finite and incomplete. This doctrine had the effect of introducing a principle of evil, in the sense of incompleteness, or a less than perfect realization, with creation itself, and of leaving man in opposition to this. Man was good, but creation contained both good and evil, or a world of light and a world of darkness, and the rectification had to come somehow through man himself. On this last point, Gnostic theory is somewhat cloudy and confused, but the ideas of a divinized man and a partly evil creation emerge with enough clearness to be considered focal doctrines. The new educationists do not deal with anything as remote and academic, favorite words of condemnation with them, as theories of creation, but they are under the same necessity which requires our ideas to reflect anterior suppositions, and we can gather from their utterances what these suppositions are. For them, the universe is not a work of divine omnipotence. All we know about it, they say, in effect, is that it is here and that it leaves unsatisfied many of man's wants. This is the reason for holding it bad or incomplete. The completing of it will be brought about through the natural process of evolution, plus the efforts that man makes through his science. It is in this reliance upon science and scientism that modern education shows its tendency to hitch itself to a cultural fashion, as Gnosticism showed its disposition to adjust Christianity to a contemporary sophistical worldview. Eliseo Vivas has pointed out that Dewey and his disciples would substitute an education for modern man which instills in the pupil an idolatry toward scientific method and contempt for the achievements of the past, thus fitting him to yield uncritically to the thorough mechanization of his life. Footnote: Eliseo Vivas, The Moral Life and the Ethical Life, Chicago, 1950. End of footnote. How widely this attitude has been spread through our channels of education can be seen by the frequency with which men now speak of the conquest of nature. If nature is something ordained by a creator, one does not speak of conquering it. The creation of a benevolent creator is something good, and conquest implies enmity and aggression. If by the same token the world is good and is ordained for man, there are certainly suggestions of Pyrrhic victory in the idea of triumphing over nature. The man of the new education, however, feels it his duty to be an invader of nature, breaking her resistance, as in war. We have just seen how both Tertullian and Plotinus attacked the attitude of scorning that which has been created while continuing to enjoy its benefits. We find further that St. Irenaeus, in his writings against the Gnostics, insists that some mysteries be left unsolved. This expresses the deep feeling, found also in the book of Genesis and in Aristotle, that there are some things it is better for man not to know than to know. Modern man, however, has reached the critical point at which he feels no qualms about demanding that nature give up all her secrets. There no longer exists any doubt in his mind as to whether he is competent in order to dispose of creation. A kind of moral self-modesty which was once present has been lost by his acceptance of a Gnostic theory of creation. A contemporary incident related to the annals of atomic science serves to illustrate this well. Among the observers of the first atomic bomb at Los Alamos in 1945 was William L. Lawrence, science editor of the New York Times. This correspondent wrote a full account of the terrifying event and closed it, as one would expect a representative modern to do, on a note of jubilation. He told how a group of observers danced with joy following the great flash and boom. They clapped their hands as they leaped from the ground, earth-bound man symbolizing the birth of a new force that for the first time gives man means to free himself from the gravitational pull of the earth that holds him down. Later, his report goes on to say, one of those present remarked, "The sun can't hold a candle to it." There are two assumptions worthy of note in this passage by the learned science editor. One is that man is the victim of gravitational force that keeps him from flying off into space, and now at last this victim has the chance to do something about his situation. He is going to end this oppression by nature. The other is that man has now improved upon the sun. The original creator did the best he could when he produced this great luminary, but at last man has surpassed him and has made something exceeding it. At once we recognize how closely this conforms with the Gnostic view, that defect lies not in the nature of man, but in the finiteness of creation, which must be overcome by man. The concept of an original disposition for man's good is now made to appear quite archaic. Man is now in the saddle and can ride anywhere. The connection between this attitude toward creation, or nature, and the philosophy underlying the kind of school which the Deweyite educators propose is not difficult to discern. The school is, of course, to be secular because a religious attitude towards the donné of the world is ruled out. Questions of first and final cause are regarded as not within the scope of education, which means that education is confined to intermediate causes. Intermediate causes are, of course, the subject matter of science, and hence this attitude has the effect of orienting all education toward science. Furthermore, since industrialism is the offspring of applied science, such education fits one ideally for the industrial order. Still further, industrialism is constantly making war upon nature, disfiguring and violating her, and the products of our educational plants can be relied to bring the right attitude toward this work. Of equally evil consequence is the Gnostic attitude toward man, which is obviously related to the foregoing. The Gnostic belief was that man is not sinful, but divine. The real evil in the universe cannot be imputed to him. His impulses are good, and there is no ground for restraining him from anything which he wants to do. The mere supposal of such a ground would mean invoking an arbiter which Gnostic thinking does not recognize. By divinizing man, Gnostic thinking says that what he wants to do, he should do. Restraints upon human nature now become blasphemous, whereas in the older thinking it was action of human nature which was blasphemous when it contravened law and ethics. Thus, the whole system of ethics becomes man-centered, and there is no sanction above man to which anything can be appealed. What man wants is considered right, and it is what, with the aid of his science, he is supposedly going to get. I suggest that this radical view of man's nature would never have gained acceptance among so many in this country had not the way been prepared for it by an influential phase of American literature. The New England transcendentalists of a century ago are a link between ancient Gnosticism and the new Gnostic educators. Ralph Waldo Emerson, the leading exponent of transcendentalism, taught forthrightly that man is divine and that his instincts are oracular. From the Divinity School address through self-reliance and to the Over-Soul, he developed the theme that man has a divine self-sufficiency and that he does not need to look beyond himself. He instilled in the many thousands who read him as the American philosopher belief not only that man bears no responsibility for evil, but even that evil is illusory. This was Emerson's rebellion against the Calvinism of his New England forebears, who had taught and acted out of a contrary belief that man is responsible for the evil which most certainly exists in the world, and that he is consequently involved in a curse for which every individual must suffer. As Calvinism, with its stern morality and its rigorous intellectualism, began to lose ground, its place was taken largely by the expansive optimism which Emerson devised, an optimism which, with its devotion to romantic illusions, was destined to take the sinew out of New England thought and culture. I mention the Transcendentalists because they, as the most articulate group of radicals in 19th century America, must bear the blame for undermining the previous realism of American thinking. Their influence has been very pervasive, and the progressivist educators have made use of that influence to put forward their heresies as expressive of the American mind and the American political spirit. Footnote. A related fact, which cannot be overlooked, is that a public school system supported by tax money was a New England conception. Tracing back to a statute enacted in Massachusetts in 1647, this system spread through the other New England colonies and states, and later over the country as a whole, although it was resisted by most of the southern states until after the Civil War. Thus, at a time when these latter-day Gnostics were coming to dominate New England thinking, the New England school system was being imitated by one state after another, including, finally, the southern states. That it would serve as a pipeline for the Gnostic philosophy of the leaders of New England opinion was virtually inevitable. End of footnote. We can now safely say that in progressive educational theory we have a Gnostic version of the image of man. It is a picture which leaves out of account his original sin, his tendency to love evil and to wreak it, and his daily sinning through egotism. It leaves out of account the dark recesses of his psyche, which even so modern a study as psychology has had to restore. The man of the Gnostics is the child of his own good nature, confusing his sentiments with the structure of the world, and inclined, when he meets obstacles that do not yield, to blame other men rather than to recognize the limitations of man. The modern Gnostics further resemble the ancient ones in their attitude toward authority. If the ancient type tended towards antinomianism, the modern type works toward a theoretical undermining of responsibility. Because human nature is so good that it is not constrainable, laws and traditions are not to be respected. The Gnostics opposed the authority of the church and the authority of the state under the impulse of their speculative picture of the universe. Again, one might mark a parallel with transcendentalism, for the individual and social protest of Emerson and Thoreau went theoretically to the point of anarchism. Both institutions and traditions were unceasingly attacked by them in the name of the liberty of the individual to follow his naturally good impulses. The opposition of the present-day Gnostics goes about the same length, although for special reasons they do not direct their attack against the state. Many of them seem to carry concealed a Marxist hope that the state may be utilized to gain their ends, after which it will wither away, or perhaps it will serve as a final target in the attack upon authoritarianism. As matters stand now, authoritarianism is the principle they chiefly decry. Because all men are equally good, no one is entitled by superior goodness to stand in authority. There are no higher degrees of virtue which authorize some individuals to lay down rules for others. Everybody cooperates, and what the generality expresses a desire for is what should be done. They overlook the contradiction in this, which is that we always have majorities and dissenters, with the ensuing problem of effecting a resolution. Their position is, however, that no external moral absolute exists by which degrees of rightness and wrongness may be determined. Where no conception of a moral absolute exists, authority has no real basis. Such are the views implied in the Gnostics' dogmatic optimism about the nature of man. As we saw in the historical survey, the ancient Gnostics denied the need of salvation because they considered man to be already in a state of blessedness. Today, this translates itself into the doctrine that human beings do not stand in need of correction, to say nothing of conversion. Obviously, if you regard man as already divine, you do not need a discipline for improving him ethically. It has been the general and indeed immemorial practice of the human race to set up some ideal type, one perfect man, and to judge the moral and intellectual worth of every human being by him. Sometimes the type was presented through religion, sometimes through mythology, and sometimes through the speculations of thinkers. In Christian lands, Christ, of course, serves as the great exemplar and standard. But what the modern educator does is take empirical man, arrive at a type through averaging, and then posit this as what man ought to be. What should be merely descriptive thus becomes prescriptive. If you believe that man is already in a saved condition, you, of course, base your ideal on what he generally has been. Then extremes, even of goodness, become deviants and need to be pulled back toward the average. The saint is but an eccentric. Such acceptance of man in his average condition must keep down the standard of development and achievement, and the result is a complacency which refuses to believe that man needs to surpass himself. It is now possible to trace the effects of this system of radical thought upon the education which the progressivists intend to give our children. Not every phase, of course, of the new Gnosticism shows a full and equal effect upon educational theory, but that the main tenets of its philosophy exert a strong influence upon the ideals and programs with which we are now confronted becomes clear enough. First, we may turn to the objects of learning. Traditional education has always been based on the assumption that there is a world of data, a fixed reality, which is worth knowing and even worth reverencing. The content of education, therefore, reflected the structure of an antecedent reality. This, in fact, was education, and everything required for its communication to learners was ancillary. Clearly, this presumes a certain respect for the world as creation, a belief in it, and a trust in its providence, rather than a view, as if out of ancient Gnosticism, positing its essential incompleteness or badness. The world is there a priori. The learner has the duty of familiarizing himself with its nature and its sets of relations. Now, all of this has been reversed. The main concern of the modern educationist is not knowledge of an existent reality, but rather the mastery of a methodology. The aim of the methodology is to enable the learner to grow through experience. These are key terms requiring some examination. The purpose of education is alleged to be growth, and growth is conceived as a natural unfolding of the individual. It is not growth towards something or away from something, because there are no ideal standards in mind. Sometimes the word richness is brought in to indicate the direction of growth, but it is necessarily and probably deliberately vague. The concealed premise of the doctrine is that the individual is naturally good, and that any kind of development of him will therefore be desirable. There is no regulative body of knowledge to impose a pattern. The individual needs only to increase the divinity that is in him by the process of growth. As for experience, it need not be qualified. All experience is good and is more rewarding than knowledge in the abstract. When Dewey declares that it is more important to make maps than to learn them, he exalts activity over thinking. While few will deny that something is gained through the practical handling of a problem, if the principle of learning solely by doing were applied exclusively, it would cut the learner off from the great body of traditional knowledge and wisdom of the race. This he cannot hope to get by experience alone. A number of progressive educators have shown by the trend of their utterances that they are quite willing to effect such a severance. This willingness is further evidenced by their attitude toward the use of symbols. On this subject, Dewey has written in The School and Society, "The relegation of the merely symbolic and formal to a secondary position is not a mere accident, but is part of the larger social evolution." Here, as elsewhere, one is forced to recognize that these revolutionaries are prepared to state their proposals, if not their basic premises, in unabashed terms. Their audaciousness, however, should not be allowed to disarm us. What Dewey is insisting upon is nothing less than a denigration of the intellect. For thousands of years, education through concepts and symbols expressing them has been recognized as the education of the mind, to which all other education is subsidiary. Through his ability to symbolize and to make use of signs, such as letters and figures, man has created practically all that goes by the name of culture. Ernst Cassirer points out that symbol making and using is the most specifically human activity, that culture and civilization depend on an elaborate network of symbols, and that the more the human being advances, the more complex these symbolic media become, should be obvious. Now their use is to be de-emphasized in the name of the larger social evolution, which is a cant phrase standing for the political aims of the progressivists. It is a strange thing in this day of progress and almost universal literacy to have to plead for the rights of the mind, and especially against educators. But as Vivas has shown, the Deweyite school is actually a group of fanatical partisans who are determined to spread their special theory of human nature in opposition to all that history and the humanists have taught us. The Gnostic belief that man is divine and already in a state of salvation displays itself very clearly in the new theory of child-centered education. The upshot of this is not merely to divinize man, which is bad enough, but to divinize the child. The progressivists worship the child as child and make concessions to him where traditional education makes demands upon him. One is compelled to infer from their statements not that the child is the probationer, but that the world of learning is. This is stated by Dewey, writing in Schools of Tomorrow. Are we to believe, with the strict disciplinarians, that education is the process of making a little savage into a man? That there are many virtues as well as facts that have to be taught to all children so that they may as nearly as possible approach the adult standard? Or are we to believe, with Rousseau, that education is the process of making up the discrepancy between the child at his birth and the man as he will need to be? That childhood has its own way of seeing, thinking, and feeling, and that the method of training these ways to what the man will need is to let the child test them upon the world about him? To commence the reply, why should we believe with the Romanticist Rousseau rather than with the strict disciplinarians? It is the experience of most parents and teachers that the child is not a little angel, but in some degree a little savage, and that he needs to be educated out of this condition. There is nothing divine about his imperfections. As for the man as he will need to be, how do we prepare anyone to become this except by initiating him, with due allowance for his limitations, into the demands and standards of the adult world? Finally, Dewey seems to be overlooking the fact that the real desire of every youngster is to be a man, and not a perfect little angel of a child. In The School and Society, Dewey cites with approval the view of the educator Friedrich Froebel that the primary root of all educative activity is in the instructive, impulsive attitudes of children, and not in the presentation and application of external material, whether through the ideas of others or through the senses. Again, like the Gnostics of old, these two see something sacred in instinctive attitudes and in the content of immature consciousness. These are to be venerated above that objectified body of learning which has been produced by systematic study and handed down by our cultural institutions. In brief, learning is to be foregone in favor of the child's spontaneous desires and unreflective thoughts. Conspicuously absent from all of this is the discipline of the negative. It is invariably assumed that the child can be depended on to develop serious interests without pressure from outside. If this were true, we would have to concede that the child is in a state of grace. The inescapable fact is, however, that the child exhibits no sustained interests, or his interests are in trivial or objectionable things. There is no more widely attested fact than that interest usually develops under pressure, and a major part of education consists of our being made to take an interest in things that ought to interest us or will require our interest as we attain adulthood. Footnote. A striking illustration of this truth came to my attention some years ago. A young engineer, an ordinary member of his profession, with an indifference toward the fine arts, obtained a job with a radio broadcasting station. This station put half an hour of classical music on the air every day, and this young man had the duty of controlling volume. Naturally, he had to listen very carefully in order to maintain this at a uniform level. This very circumstance of having to listen carefully to classical music in discharge of his duty caused him to hear in it things he had been unaware of, with the result that he became a devotee. If this accidental outside pressure had not forced him to give careful attention to these programs, he probably never would have been recruited into the ranks of music appreciators. End of footnote. Effective education often demands the rigorous suppressing of a present, desultory interest so that we can focus on things that have a real, enduring, and sanctioned interest. Indeed, this is identical with the act of concentration. When we concentrate, we rule out the lesser, the peripheral, the seductive interest so that we can get on with the problem we are obliged to solve. I believe it could be demonstrated that progressive techniques of education have done a good deal to lessen the powers of concentration of the present generation of students who have been exposed to them. This belief in the natural goodness of the child and the rightness of spontaneous expression leads to the progressivists' assault upon virtually all forms of authority and discipline in the classroom. They proceed on the assumptions that fear is never a good thing, and that authority must produce fear. The first is that although authority does sometimes induce fear, it also provides protection, support, and confirmation. It may hold together the organization on which we depend for the exercise of opportunities. Second, not all fear is bad. There are fears that are normal and salutary. We need to fear constantly a variety of dangers, some of which arise from our own nature. We need to fear sloth, carelessness, indifference, and the temptations of appetite. The possibility of ignominy keeps a healthful fear hanging over us, and it is authority which maintains this fear by enforcing the appropriate penalties if we succumb to indolence or to positive evil doing. Accordingly, the Gnostics of education feel that they can bring their dream world nearer to reality by introducing democracy in the classroom. Under this weird conception, the teacher is not to be viewed as one in authority commissioned to instruct, but as a kind of moderator whose function is merely to conduct a meeting. Especially resented is the idea that the teacher has any advantage of knowledge or wisdom which entitles him to stand above his students. This would be recognition of inequality, and equality must reign, ruat caelum. The resultant undermining of the authority and prestige of the teacher in public schools is a long story, and the story is now being told by a number of teachers who have experienced it. It is important to show the theoretical objections to this democratic maneuver. Not only is the teacher supposed to be apologetic about his superior knowledge, he is expected to give up one of the most valuable of pedagogical devices, which is the dramatic confrontation of master and pupil. Our traditional means of education has a most important resource in this situation. That one is admitted to be master and the other learner is a circumstance of good effect because it works to tone up the performance of both. The teacher stays on his toes trying to justify by superior knowledge and skill the office that is vested in him. The learner tries to earn the good opinion of the teacher by matching his performance as nearly as he can. In this way, a vital tension is set up, and the powerful force of emulation is brought into play. The teacher is going to give the best that he has, and he is going to ask the ordinary mortal sitting there in row 3 to rise above his ordinary mortality and to excel. A healthful rivalry thus creates standards of criticism. How the progressivists expect to compensate for this with a kind of relaxed, democratic, shoulder-rubbing camaraderie in which the teacher is just one of the boys is another mystery of the assault upon criteria. For the teacher requires the magisterial stance in order to get the most from his pupils. The old New Englanders, although they developed a number of democratic forms, knew where democracy was in place and where not. The ministers of their churches they called teachers, and the teacher in the school was a kind of minister in the classroom. There was no sentimental blurring of the roles of instructor and learner. I suspect the fact that New England had thus established a firm intellectual tradition enabled the Gnostic thinkers, when they came into ascendancy there, to exert much more influence than their doctrines otherwise would have secured for them. In review, we see in this startling revolution the substitution of fantasy for historicity. Not only the traditional educator, but also the man in the street, when he is apprised of these facts, knows that the progressive educators are not dealing in truth. The reason is that they have set themselves up as messianic prophets, whose prophecy is of a special political world. Therefore, they are not primarily educators. An educator is a man inspired with deference toward the world's knowledge and prepared to communicate some phase of it to oncoming generations. One does not have to strip off many wrappings to see that the progressive educators are, by contrast, political ideologues. They are determined to destroy the organic society which we have inherited by postulating an equalitarian natural man as the grand end of all endeavor. Appreciating this fact enables us to understand their attack upon discipline and authority, their opposition to systems of grading and promotion, and their resistance to formal intellectual learning. Almost any question about their assumptions and their methods, if pushed far enough, will bring the defense that these are vindicated by their contribution to democracy. Their writings are filled with references to democracy as a way of life. This in turn has led to strange cant about education for democratic living. There are several things to be said about this piece of sentimental affectation. For one thing, as we have pointed out elsewhere, democracy is not a way of life, but a form of government. Government is not the substance of a people's life, although modern collectivism would persuade us to think so. Government in all free societies is a regulative machinery whose task it is to provide protection and to preserve enough order for people to do what they can do for themselves as individual members of society. This identification of democracy with life is a rhetorical way of sneaking in the totalitarian concept. For another, democracy is not the only conceivable form of government, although it has virtually become dogma to say so. It was not so regarded by Aristotle, who made aim rather than form the criterion of true government. The most that can be said is that democracy seems to be the best of the available choices for us today, and it is well for the student to be taught in what ways democracy is practical for us. But training for a form of government is neither the sole nor the primary object of education. Man may, by one classification, be a political animal, but political activity is not his highest expression. He is also a contemplative animal and a creature with aesthetic and cultural yearnings. His very restlessness is a sign that he is a spiritual being with intimations about his origin and destiny. The matters with which education should deal include all these, and not merely his political orientation and allegiance. Liberal education has flourished under and contributed to many forms of government, although there may be grave doubt as to whether it is compatible with the current concept of mass democracy. Insistence upon a political theory as the principle by which all educational policies are to be adjudicated is totalitarian radicalism. Sentimentalism about the nature of the human being and his political fanaticism have thus combined to produce a concept of education treacherous to our regime. It represents the most overweening attempt of Gnostic thinking to replace the natural structure of our society with their dream world, which is to substitute a subjective wishfulness for an historical reality. From the beginning, I have spoken of the progressive movement in education as an apostasy out of conviction that this classifies it accurately. An apostate is properly defined as one who, after making profession of a belief, falls away from or abandons it. So with the progressive educators. They profess before society a belief in education, and they are in fact supported by society for this profession. In reality, they are attackers and saboteurs of education. This truth I have tried to show by two lines of proof, namely, that the apostates do not have faith in the existence of knowledge, and that their real aim is the educationally illicit one of conditioning the young for political purposes. The fact that they do not believe in knowledge makes them manipulators or trainers rather than teachers, and this is the light in which we should understand their instrumentalist philosophy. The world for which the progressivists are conditioning their students is not the world espoused by general society, but by a rather small minority of radical doctrinaires and social faddists. They are doing things which the great majority of plain, uncorrupted individuals, from a standpoint in history and common sense, would repudiate if they could see their tendency. This subversion has gone so far that Gnostics of education, until very recently, constituted the greatest single threat to our culture. In the discredit that they have cast upon the higher faculties, in the way that they have cut the young off from knowledge of the excellencies achieved in the past, and in the way they have turned attention towards transient externals and away from the central problem of man, they have no equal as an agency of subversion. Their schemes are exactly fitted, if indeed they are not designed, to produce citizens for the secular communist state, which is the millennial dream of the modern Gnostic. To put an end to this adventure into fantasy, and to prevent the cruel awakening which would follow, we should do all we can, educationally and politically, to hasten the decline of their influence. Thank you very much for listening. If you enjoy my work, please consider donating to my Buy Me a Coffee page, which you can find linked on my YouTube channel. Thank you.